Assalamu alaikum and welcome to MPAC UK's podcast Reason. MPAC UK is a Muslim public civil liberties group which wants to see Muslims engaged in tackling Islamophobia in media and politics. Our podcasts will provide a framework for you to understand the state of our ummah and of Islamophobia today, and to help you understand what needs to be done to help the oppressed. Some of the podcasts will be part of a regular book club series called Information is Power. But enough of all that. I'm Ahmed Hussein, and today I'll be your voice of reason. The book we'll be covering today is Orientalism, written by Edward Said. Edward was a Palestinian academic working in the mid to late 20th century and wrote Orientalism in 1978 in order to expose the stereotyping by Western academics of the East, which he saw as dominating the narrative of the East throughout history. One of the central themes of the book is that knowledge about the East is generated not through facts, but through imagined constructs. These constructs imagine Eastern societies as fundamentally similar and sharing the characteristics that are not possessed by Western societies. So here to discuss the book further with me is Asma, and a colleague and campaigner from MPAC UK. How are you today?
Assalamu alaikum, Ahmed. Alhamdulillah.
So you've gone through the book and you've sent me some quotes that really spoke to you. I'm just going to go through the first quote, and you tell me what was it exactly about it that really spoke to
Yeah.
you. So this is a quote from the book. Every single empire in its official discourse has said that it is not like all the others, that its circumstances are special, and that it has a mission to enlighten, civilize, bring order and democracy, and that it uses force only as a last resort. And sadder still, there always is a chorus of willing intellectuals to say calming words about benign or altruistic empires, as if one shouldn't trust the evidence of one's eyes, watching the destruction and the misery and death brought by the latest mission to civilize. What are your thoughts on that quote?
Well, my thoughts on that quote is it really is a pinnacle moment in the starting of the book. It really frames how the West portrays the East. And as someone who grew up from roots from the East, so from South Asia, and as a Muslim as well, but being brought up and born into the Western hemisphere, I understand both perspectives, and I can see the subtle racism, and I can see the double standards. Languages and pictures used within our institutions, whether it is the education system, whether it is the policing system, whether it is the government systems that are used, the institutional racism has always portrayed people from the East, whether it is that you're Muslim Arab or you're South Asian Arab, or whether you're an African Muslim, you're always portrayed within two main stereotypes, either that you're barbaric or that you are backwards. If we look back through the course of history, and we always see like movies, or we see books, and we see all this literature come into our lives, the one thing we always notice the most is that the East is always the bad guy. So whether it is they've portrayed a stereotypical Muslim Arab, or, wherever it is, someone from that era, is always the bad guy. And it's always the West. Yeah. So, and it's always the West. It's always the West that comes in they're the knight in shining armor, and it's only the West that can save the day, and it's them with all the technology, and it's them with everything that good in this world that they can do to save the world. Well, and you just take a step back and you think, hang on, why is it that we are always the bad guys? Why is it never that it's the West that's the bad guys? So it just shows you how stereotypical and how how would you word this? So not even stereotypical, how dehumanizing it is to people in the East to be always portrayed in such a bad light, that people in the West only ever look towards the East with, shall we say a shielded eye, so they would always see us as the bad guys.
Something I would add to that is that it's really, really interesting that this was written in the 70s, and obviously at a time when the Palestinian liberation movement was not exactly as popular as it is today, and he's got that frame of reference, and that's the time he's writing in, and yet it still remains relevant today because when I think about the so-called war on terror and the mentality behind it, which is that the West was attacked and now the West needs to bring justice and revenge upon those who attacked the US on 9/11. And in terms of like the whole system and the whole justification around all of that, it's still a lens through which the West and its intellectuals and its journalists and its politicians still view the world and still act on the world, like impact their will upon the world. Another quote that you sent through, I'll just read through it now. Um, the Orient and Islam have a kind of extra-real, phenomenologically reduced status that puts them out of reach of everyone except the Western expert. From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was to represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through and had been made firm by the refining fire of the Orientalists' work. So, what does that quote mean to you?
We see it all the time. We see the double standards, the constant hypocrisy within the media, the types of languages and pictures they use to portray Muslims is absolutely diabolical, and it's dehumanizing towards Muslims. That's why most times when anything happens to Muslims, that no one ever sees it with with humanity. They see it as us being backwards and barbaric. Therefore, they no longer need sympathy in life, or they no longer need an empathy in life. Now, the West, to be able to always portray people of the East and Muslims as the bad guys, they've always used a lens that has a stereotypical vision of people and Muslims from the East. Either that we don't fit into their way of life and they have to come and save us because, you know, we're oppressed and we don't have freedom of speech and we don't have this and we don't have that. However, our ways of life may be different to the West, and that's okay. But every time that they frame Islam as a problem, every time that they frame Islam as their problem, they've dehumanized Muslims. So that gives them an easier way to come in and free us. However, what they are doing with their imperialism and with their colonization is coming into Muslim lands, killing millions of people. You know, there's over 1 million people dead in Iraq. There's over 1 million dead people in Syria. Libya is in absolute tatters. And that only happened because of Western imperialism. Their ways of freeing us are not freeing us. You know, Islam has so many answers for today's society, but because we have been dehumanized for almost a century now, we have been dehumanized so badly that when people look at Islam, they see Islam as only a problem.
And there's a danger with that. There's a danger with with an external, someone from the West putting their analysis on top of the East to the point where it sort of like silences and crushes any dissenting, any different opinion. Because again, like looking at the current so-called war on terror, what we see is a lot of intellectuals, academics, and so on, and politicians and journalists justifying the framework of, yeah, this is what we have to do to these extremists, to these Muslims, to these jihadists, etc., etc. And we know best because we've done the analysis, and there's no need to listen. There's no need to try to understand what the other side thinks. And the reason that's a real problem is because once the academics and intellectuals become really good at silencing the differing opinions, then someone else can pick up that same analysis, that same system of silencing dissent, and use it in their own context. So basically, to cut a long example short, if you look at what's been happening in China, in East Turkestan to the Uyghur Muslims, the very same narrative of the war on terror, the very same narrative of cutting down the extremists and cutting down extremist opinions and extremism enablers and so on. That same narrative is what is being used to justify China's concentration camps of the Uyghur Muslims. And it really is interesting seeing the West, the US, NATO, and its allies looking at China in disgust of its treatment of Muslims, when the very same concepts that China is using is basically the same concept that they were using for the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the destruction of so many other places.
Just to add on to what you're saying as well, is that every time the blame also comes back on us as a ummah. Every time we've allowed them to put this narrative across and we've not countered it, and our Muslim imams have not countered it, our Muslim scholars have not countered it, our Muslim leaders have not countered it. And because we haven't, every single time we've allowed them to do that, we've allowed them to bury Islam, we've allowed them to bury our ummah, we've allowed them the destruction of our religion, we've allowed them the destruction of our ummah, we've allowed them to have the destruction over so many different points of the East, and there has been no counter defense to that. And because we've done that, we've allowed them for us to become this way. We've become lost. We've become like almost lost sheep in a desert, because we don't know what's going on anymore, because we've allowed them to bury so much of our religion and so much of what we stand for and so much of what we were meant to be standing for.
I mean, I just want to echo your point. Like we have in terms of leadership in the Muslim community, they talk about what they know, and the only thing they know are, the ritual aspects and, the spiritual aspects of the religion. They have next to no will. They have next to no will or ability to try to untangle geopolitics, to untangle why is the Ummah in the state is. The only solutions they provide is, make sure you do your fard prayers and your fard obligations and your fard rituals, which is fine. Yeah, it's fine. But it's not the solution, because if you just look at the examples of the early generations, they didn't spread Islam just by staying in Masjid al-Haram and praying all of their 5 daily prayers there. Even though that would have been the best place to do their 5 daily prayers, they didn't just stay there or in Masjid al-Nabawi. They traveled, they moved, they had discourse, they learnt about the world, they utilized what they learnt about the world, they learnt about the politicians and the leaders of their world, and again they utilized that as well. They didn't just sit back and say, we've been guaranteed Jannah and that's enough for us. No, they wanted to spread Islam, because Islam is such a human and humanizing religion. It's a movement for justice, and it brings good where it is applied, inshallah, around the world.
And I want to add to that, there's apps like social media addresses so many solutions. Like people that used to walk around with disillusional glasses, shall we say, are now able to see the religion for itself, because sometimes you can't hide everything, and the West has tried so much so to hide Islam portray it in such a bad light. But it takes us to counter that narrative through social media, through YouTube, through whatever source of means there is, that Islam is coming to its true light. But it means that we have to put ourselves forward.
Moving on to the next quote then. So Arabs, for example, are thought of as camel-riding, terroristic, hook-nosed, venal lechers whose undeserved wealth is an affront to real civilization. Always there lurks the assumption that although the Western consumer belongs to a numerical minority, he is entitled either to own or to expend, or both, the majority of the world resources. Why? Because he, unlike the Oriental, is a true human being. And this speaks a lot to what you were saying before in terms of how the default position, the default angle, when it comes to criticizing the East, Western journalists and so on are very, very happy to jump onto the sort of like the paradigm of they are backwards, that they behave differently to us because they haven't advanced as much, whether it's in terms of material or morals or so on. But yeah, what was it about this quote that really spoke?
What stood out for me about this is because we ourselves have become with that mindset that, people back home live a certain way, or they think a certain way, or they do things a certain way. And us, the Ummah, have become like that as well, especially with us living in the West. But what else stood out for me with this is that just because your way of life is different to their way of life doesn't make you more human or doesn't make you higher above them than you. We are all human beings. If we all cut ourselves, our blood is all the same color. Um, so, just because you're living in a certain part of the world doesn't mean that you are of a higher being just because your way of life is different to somebody else's way of life. We
That's a
can
really
all
good
be
point.
equal and yeah, we can all be equal and still have different ways of living. What stood out for me about this is because we ourselves have become with that mindset that, people back home live a certain way, or they think a certain way, or they do things a certain way. And us, the Ummah, have become like that as well, especially with us living in the West. But what else stood out for me with this is that just because your way of life is different to their way of life doesn't make you more human or doesn't make you higher above them than you. We are all human beings. If we all cut ourselves, our blood is all the same color. Um, so, just because you're living in a certain part of the world doesn't mean that you are of a higher being just because your way of life is different to somebody else's way of life.
That's
We
a
can
really
all
good
be
point.
equal and we can all be equal and still have different ways of living. And as much as they portray us as backwards people, they never show you that from Islam came algebra, from Islam came libraries, from Islam came astrology, from Islam came medicine. And as much as they portray us as backwards people, they never show you that from Islam came algebra, from Islam came libraries, from Islam came astrology, from Islam came medicine, from Islam.
And this does follow on from what we were talking about before. If the Western intellectuals, the chattering classes, whatever you want to call them, if they are too effective at putting forward their narrative and at crushing the dissenting opinions, then the only way of looking at the world that's going to be given to you, and I'm talking about Muslims here. I'm not talking about Islamophobes who want to
Yeah,
look for ways to criticize Muslims. Even Muslims will only be presented with a narrative, with a way of looking at the world that puts the East or the Muslims or whatever as the default criminal, the default villain, the default sort of like, oh, there's something about being a Muslim, there's something in Islam that makes us want to become extremists, makes us want to become, I should be doing air quotes every time I say extremists, actually,
yeah.
extremists, jihadists, terrorists, etc., etc. And what that leads
Mm.
to, obviously, is self-hatred in terms of wanting to give up on the religion itself, wanting to give up on the community, throwing the community under the bus, throwing, the religion under the bus. And before you know it, there's ex-Muslims who try to outdo each other and outdo Islamophobes in terms of their rhetoric and their open disdain and hatred for the religion. So, this is another really potent consequence of leaving a narrative to fester when that narrative is completely baseless and built on, you know, just the other, just the difference, just the fact that, oh, because they're different, they must be less than us. I'm going to
Yeah.
move on to the next quote. Um, this one's a really short one. To say simply that Orientalism was a rationalization of colonial rule is to ignore the extent to which colonial rule was justified in advance by Orientalism rather than after the fact. So that's a short, punchy quote. What was
Yeah.
it that stood out to you?
So we need to really focus on two different aspects on this. So the first and foremost is the colonial mindset. And the colonial mindset is that if we make them think that we need to come over there and rescue them, then they'll be able to accept what we're going to do to them, right? And what I mean by that is, look what they did in Libya. They went over there, told them, we need to get you away from whoever it is that is, oppressing you. We need to you need to be coming towards the Western way. We need to free you. So they came, bombed Libya, so-called liberating the people. Look at Libya today. Their oil reserves have been taken by the US and France. You have to pay almost $10 for a loaf of bread. Before, education was free, housing was free. You had part of the oil reserves that were sold a part of that profit came directly to each and every single person in Libya that was a Libyan citizen. Your healthcare was free. When you got married, you got 50k in your account. What do they have now? They have none of that. They weren't liberated. They have now become even more oppressed. So when the West comes around with this colonial mindset and then tells us that, we are your light and shining armor, and we've accepted that is part of the problem. So that is just one part of it. The second part, what they've done is that they've made us become self-haters, hating our own religion, hating our color of our skin. You can only be, there's this concept with all women that, you're only beautiful if if you're fair skin or fair hair or fair eyes. And you have women trying to change the color of their skin and the color of their hair and, doing all sorts to their faces just to make them look more westernized. So when that colonial mindset comes into the East, it isn't just about a physical dominance over the East. It's also a mental dominance over the East as well. So we've become self-hating in ourselves.
That quote is a good way to bring this conversation to a close, because basically it's a warning and a reminder from this book that was written in the 70s that the ideological justification for another war comes first.
Yeah.
And so if you start hearing conversations by politicians, by journalists and so on, that, such and such a country is doing something wrong, is less human than us, then that's alarm bells. That's the warning bell of an upcoming military conflict coming up. The ideology, the idea of a conflict comes before the conflict itself.
Yeah.
And that obviously applies right now, and it's always going to apply. So do you have any other thoughts on the book, Asma? That quote is a good way to bring this.
So for us as a ummah, we need to learn to read between the lines of what is being put out, first of all in the media, and then secondly within our literature. But also what we need to remember is that with Orientalism, how it applies to Muslims today. The example is the whole Morocco football match. Everyone felt that zeal inside of them, like, wow, like this is a Muslim team doing really, really well. We've got so far, but yet they started arguing. Are the Moroccans Arabs? Are they Amazigh? Are they Berbers? Are they African? Are they this? Are they that? It doesn't matter, because Islam doesn't teach you that. Islam teaches you that you are a Muslim and you are united under one flag, not a flag of a country, not a border, but you are united under one flag, which is La ilaha illallah. And that is it. It doesn't matter if you're an Arab. It doesn't matter if you're a Berber Muslim, or if you're an Amazigh Muslim, or if you're a Palestinian Muslim, or if you're a Pakistani Muslim, or if you're an Indian Muslim. What matters is that you are Muslim. And we need to come out of this defeated mindset and start making ourselves independent to what the West makes us as, and labeling us as terrorists or extremists for believing in action with inaction. Become politically active, join groups like MPACUK, and become a part of the solution of the dehumanizing of Islam.
All right, Jazakallah khairan, Asma, for your time, and we're going to have to leave it there.
Yep.
for today's recording. And next month's book club will continue with the autobiography of Malcolm X, inshallah. So whether you've read the book or not, give it another read this coming month and leave a comment on what you think Muslims today could learn from the life of our brother Malcolm El-Shabbaz, rahimahullah. Until then, remember to always listen to reason. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.